do that. Perfect. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to be in conversation with Chelsea T. Hicks, who's the author of A Calm and Normal Heart, a debut collection that just found its way to me about, was it 8 months ago now? And I was so eager to support the book and be in conversation with Chelsea, and have just loved reading this collection. And I will begin by just acknowledging our place here at Notre Dame and the series and what we do. I am going to ask that everybody mute their microphones. Please take a second to make sure you've done that. I see there's a few people who haven't. Anybody who is logging on, welcome. Please mute your microphones. Thank you very much. I think there's one other person. EE, if you could mute your mic. I'm not sure. Or Pauline, if you could make sure everybody's mics are muted.
I have muted them.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you. So we here at the University of Notre Dame acknowledge our presence on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for thousands of years and continue to do so. We recognize our own place in the history and practices of colonialism and understand that our responsibilities extend beyond this gesture of land acknowledgement. We must also reflect on the University of Notre Dame's past, present, and future relationship with the original stewards of this land and actively pursue ways to amend this troubled relationship. Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance is an interdisciplinary research collective and lecture series focused on questions of human rights and the arts in the global Middle East, Southwest Asia, and North Africa, although it is not exclusive to these regions. It's co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters and by the Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies, and housed at the Initiative on Race and Resilience, which is directed by Professor Mark Sanders. We are also partnered with Brookline Booksmith's Transnational Literary Series this year, and I want to thank them for their collaboration with us and encourage you all to purchase our guests' books through Brookline Booksmith, and the link will be in the chat. So I am Azareen Oloomi. I'm a professor here at the University of Notre Dame in the MFA program for creative writing. And I'm also a fellow at the Kroc Institute. And I founded Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance in 2019. We kicked it off in 2020. And it was really important for me that we have a collaborative and collective methodology of conversation and research. So we have a lot of partners in different institutions, Harvard's Peace, Religion, and Conflict Initiative, NYU's Kevorkian Center. We have partners in Berlin, Fri Jan Universität, who specialize in Palestinian studies. And here at Notre Dame, we have a lot of board members who are in different departments. So I think we're a bit of an unusual entity. Academia tends to be very, very singular minded and sort of focused on the individual's intellectual output, but we're kind of really, doing something that honors collective thinking and collaborative thinking. And one of our board members, Francisco Robles, is here today with us. So there you are, Francisco, hello. So thank you all again for being here, and I'll pass it over to Mojtaba, who'll give an introduction, a more proper introduction of Chelsea. She will then read and we'll begin our conversation.
Thank you, Azareen. Welcome, everyone. I am Mojtaba Kashani, coordinator of Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance event series at the University of Notre Dame. As you can see, we are in Zoom meeting mode, which means you are free to keep your cameras on. Please do so if you are comfortable. It's wonderful for our speakers to be able to see their audience. I would like to thank our partners. This event is presented in partnership with Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies at NYU. We are also partnered with the Transnational Literature Series at Brooklyn Booksmith, and I want to thank them for their collaboration with us and encourage you to purchase our guest book through Brooklyn Booksmith. Feel free to make your purchases anytime throughout the event. This afternoon, our guest is Chelsea Hicks. The conversation will be moderated by Azareen Vliet Oloomi. I will read an introduction for each guest shortly. There will be time at the end of the event for Q&A, so please at any time feel free to leave your question in the chat and we will get to as many as we can during the Q&A period, during which you will also be invited to raise your hand. Chelsea Hicks is a graduate of the Institute of American Indian Arts MFA in Creative Writing and holds an MA from the University of California at Davis. She is a Tulsa Artist Fellow and Native Arts and Cultures Foundation Lift Awardee. Her writing has been published in Poetry Magazine, Max Swanzies, Yellow Medicine Review, the LA Review of Books, Indian Country Today, The Believer, The Audacity, the Paris Review, and elsewhere. Her advocacy includes work with Northern and Southern California Osage diaspora groups and heritage language creative writing and revitalization workshops. She lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on ancestral land. Chelsea Hicks is the author of the collection of short stories, A Calm and Normal Heart, which was recently longlisted for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. It is my pleasure to invite Azareen and Chelsea to begin this event.
Thank you, Mushtaba. And Azareen, it's so wonderful to be here. And I want to introduce myself briefly to everyone in my language, and I'll share a few thoughts about what I think about writing and my philosophy of art, and then I will read to you. Awe, Wajaje Jaji Khuladoin, Etsi Dasile Owadli, Mingshe, Azo Atsia. Hi, everybody. My name is Khuladoin and belong to the Gentle Peacemaker clan of the Wajaje people, and I live here in Tulsa, and I'm very grateful to be here today. Just noting that Tulsa is the ancestral hunting grounds of Osage people and ancestral land of Caddos, as well as today the location of the reservations of the Muskogee, Cherokee, and Osage people intersect here in this town. It's also the location of the Tulsa Race Massacre, where many Black and African American people were displaced, and there's rebuilding of Greenwood today. So just want to acknowledge all that much. And yeah, so I loved the invitation to kind of share my philosophy of writing just a little bit. And I think of writing essentially as a ritual to intend something. In art, I think of it the same way, but I'm going to talk sort of specifically about writing and then a little bit more about art. And I'll share my screen. So writing itself, I think of it when I say a way of undertaking a ritual, I mean that the writer, the artist is either mirroring or acknowledging something that for some reason is unnamed or maligned or not acknowledged or denied by a certain community or group. And the writing can imagine kind of a new path or future, or else writing can revision and restory something that has already occurred in the past, but which is in some way been maligned or not acknowledged. But for me, the purpose is always to create attention to things as they really are and as they might be or might have been, whether that's through allegory or speculative fiction or realism, it doesn't matter. I think that there's just some truth that the artist is getting at. And when for some reason, a past, a present, or an imagined future is not acknowledged, writing can be a mirror for change or basically beginning to realize or address something, just something that's not very much talked about. And I like writing as well as believe writing can be limited because of its privateness in a way, and its remove from life, that you're kind of alone when you read. I think that's important because it allows you to go at your own pace and think through sensitive things at your own timing and kind of in a safer place. So yeah, writing can be kind of like a pathway for future change, with the first step being acknowledgement and another step being imagining or creating kind of a motivation for possible future action. I do also believe that stories contain information which just help us navigate life. I agree with something N. Scott Momaday has said, which is that stories can help us clarify our understanding of the world. So all these functions of story are important for me, but I'm definitely most interested in kind of writing and art as a way of imagining future pathways forward. And for me, the act of imagining and writing is kind of like a praying or a meditating for something to change or heal or be addressed. And the act of writing as imagining, I do think, is kind of a first step to finding that change. The limits in writing for me in particular is that it's not physical. So I really believe that markings, like shapes, there are manifestations of movement and the physical world. And writing kind of gets into the invisible world, in that it's artificial. It only becomes physical when it's spoken. And so yeah, it puts us at a remove from the world temporarily because it is artificial. And that can be good because it functions kind of like going into a cave. The caves, metaphorically, literally, could be. But there are certain types of healing and living that I believe have to occur in connection with land and in connection with people. And so stories are limited in that they can be somewhat removed, and not everyone has a habit also of accessing all formats of stories, depending on what mediums people are habituated to. Think of TV versus TikTok versus books versus oral tradition. And I also believe that language is limited in that some things are actually pre-articulation. That is, they're pre-language or maybe post-language. Rather, it's another language, the language of markings, of physicality, of movement, of the world. That language can speak to the spirit. So in Wajaja in my ancestral language, which isn't very much spoken, it's undergoing revitalization. The worldview of the language acknowledges the agency of land, plants, entities like that. And the word for writing is waleze. That word, waleze, is the same word for markings, designs, patterns. I believe that language merges from landscapes. And when the language goes away from the landscape from which it emerged, it undergoes changes that morph its worldview away from that connection toward land as relatives. So right now, because I'm wanting to work with our language, I'm trying to work with physical and embrace the ways that writing is physical. Specifically, you might have heard, if you're writing in a notebook, that kind of changes your experience of learning or taking in information. So this is like a ekphrasis, I make this shawl, which is not traditional. It's like powwow style with a design I'm kind of dreamed up, and then making it, dancing with it, taking a picture of it, writing in response to it. Weaving, Osages used to, when we make these shirts, our shirts used to be the fabric that would be sold to us, specifically in the 1920s and 1930s, and in the Osage County, it would be severely upcharged. And so I'm dreaming, what if we had access to making to these ways of looms? Would we have made our own fabric? Because we have finger weaving, but we don't use a loom. And then this idea of there's this connection to land, and then it just it kind of dissolves as you assimilate and you move away from your traditions. So like a tight connection and then a loosening. And I want to make visual poems because I feel that what I'm trying to articulate right now, I don't have language for it. So I'm just working with, it may just be part of the process for me, but that's how I think about writing, is just as a very, I go into a physical place experience, words come out of that, and hopefully it reconnects to peoples and community. So yeah. Also, the last thing I want to note is that markings, like this physical thing that I'm asserting, I think has this power to heal us just by looking at it and interacting with it. And how that those lines and the physical world, if you've ever gone through something, you know, you just find yourself staring at something. It's a healing process, I believe. And the five senses can be a healing process, as well as, you know, violence is physical. And so the original, you know, markings that aren't artificial come from water, from nature, from the world. So these are markings too. And that it's, I don't know, I think of it that way. Okay. So I guess it's time to read. Let's see. So this is my book, A Calm and Normal Heart. And I'm just going to read a little bit. The dedication poem, which is in our orthography, Wajaja orthography, created by Dr. Herman Mowgray Lookout this century. And then in Latinized characters, which are what we know in English. And then in a translation. So I'll read the Wajaja and the translation. Non se waspe wita, oenki shte, da da oju look on da. Non se waspe wita, hoenki shte, da da oju look on the gachape. Zechompe och daska gala zechompe ego mingshe hoenki ski bret si wita bachena ilape ena kako data zani dota hudapa kako da walushonta aji non se waspe hoenki etsi khan atsi here. My functional heart, where are you? What turned you into an empty glass? Is it that I love the spiders and am like one? Wherever I go, making my house, I have only to wait, and all things come to me, and therein break their necks. But a calm and normal heart, where does that come from? And I think I might actually stop there because I've talked for so long.
Thank you, Chelsea. I could listen to you talk for longer, but let me start by just reading a quote about this book, this collection, by one of my favorite authors, Louise Erdrich, who wrote that Chelsea T. Hicks's deadpan, dexterous wit can make you laugh and cry in the space of a heartbeat. A Calm and Normal Heart is the book I've been waiting for. Audacious, tender, and fiercely committed. And as Mojtaba mentioned, I'm really excited because we just got this news. I think it was 2 days ago that the collection has been longlisted for the Penn Robert Bingham Prize for a debut short story collection. So we're all rooting for you, and congratulations. I really think that this book is fiercely committed to your own singular vision as a writer, and your boldness in terms of your approach to form. And you know, I'm always really interested in the way that inhabiting our ancestral language that is always kind of running beneath and around and adjacent and above English, right? As a language that in some ways we all have very different relationships to. Sometimes it can be a playful language to kind of expand and manipulate in order to hold multiple versions of ourselves. Other times the relationship can feel very troubling and much like a defeat. So, I wanted to actually start by really honing in on the opening story, which is short and understated in its capaciousness. And we start with a scene, that is about a representation of a movie that is actually, I believe, still forthcoming and due to come out in 2023. But I think the story kind of captures this feeling of fracturing when it comes to identity. And what I mean by that is the representation of identity, right, by people who are outside of one's ancestral culture, and then one's own representations of identity, and then the perception of identity from within community of one another, and the way that each citizen in that community is holding the identity of the larger tribe or the larger nation, and then also turning the gaze back on the settler culture. And I think it's interesting that you start with this representation of this film, which is, happening in the real world, which is called Killers of the Flower Moon. And it's a film, it's an American Western crime drama. It's directed by Martin Scorsese. And it's basically based on a nonfiction book by the same title. And it's capturing the crimes and the murders that were committed against the Osage Nation once oil was discovered on tribal land and on displaced tribal land as well, right? So just the double violence there is really important to underscore. And then we kind of start with that, with the arrival of the protagonist to town, and everybody kind of murmuring about who is kind of participating in the production of this film. And, Martin Scorsese and the team hired Osage advisors, cultural advisors, and then I think just the way that the representation of the filming is portrayed is really interesting. And then a couple pages later, the other main character who's with the protagonist, and they're sort of debating whether or not they should hook up, right? So this kind of more primal interaction, but what he hands to her is a poem that I think of as a kind of counter narrative. And the protagonist receives this poem from him and says, well, this is very strange. And the poem is, I'll briefly say one of the things that struck me was using Wajaji words to describe animate and inanimate objects and where they're placed in space. So like if an object is laying down or standing up, it's referred to differently. And when the poem gets to a scene of describing shoppers in a Walmart, suddenly all the objects are just inanimate, right? Versus until that point, we have animate, inanimate objects being described. And it's just this like onslaught of plastic that's being purchased. And I thought it was so brilliant. And it's such a strange performance piece inside of a story that's also about the performance of a film. So how did you kind of hold all of that together? And I don't know if maybe you want to read a tiny piece of the story so everyone can hear it, because I just think it's a brilliant story. So expansive and just so cutting in its intellect.
Wow, I love hearing you describe and articulate it. It's very lovely for me. Yes, I'd love to read a bit. And just a funny note, last night I had a dream about meeting that I met Martin Scorsese. And so it's so funny to hear you talk about it. Yeah, that movie will come out at Cannes this year, I believe. Cannes. Okay, Tsehombe. That means spider, tsehombe. One time, between a breakup and a shack up, I went home for a visit. I had most of my stuff in my car, but I didn't really want to move into my aunt's place, so I went to the laundromat to procrastinate. I parked right across the street from the yellow house where my Ika used to live all the time she divorced my grandfather. An old man was traveling down the street, headed west via lawnmower, and an orange tabby cat greeted me as I roamed in and started up the laundry. There was no one else around. I sat in the gentle breeze from the open windows and listened to the grasshoppers sing on the long grass of the hill behind the building as I opened an old newspaper. Inside was an article dated from 2 summers ago telling about the movie. The movie went without introduction among Wajaje people, as it was telling one of our stories at the hand of a big-name director with a cast of equally famous celebrities. They were filming the story of how Ishtanchi's spouses of my ancestors had murdered them with the plan of inheriting our oil money. This had happened to many of our ancestors, and the film was sending a shockwave through the tribe, as we did not often talk openly about old traumas. At the end of the article, there was a call for actors with audition information. Like most Wajaje people living in town, I'd auditioned, but I was not one of the few who made it. So I'll skip to this poem that the narrator's friend, possibly more than friend, hands to her that he made from his language class, from a lesson in his language class. Vinkshe, she, kan. Hold on, I'm just going to mute somebody who. Okay, we're good. Vinkshe, she, kan, se, the, ge, ba, the, she, ga, their ba, thereby. I imagine myself vinkshe, sitting, round, singular, animate or inanimate, in the middle of my rug, back in the home of my Ina in Gawaji Dawa. I imagine myself kshe, lying, long, singular, animate or inanimate entity, on my bed in a hoodie, alone for once, headphones in. I imagine myself ka, standing, singular, animate entity, in a clean room, wherever it was, drinking a smoothie after vacuuming. I imagine myself tse, standing, singular, inanimate entity, because I had stood there so long I had become a lamp, a dead tree, a bolt of metal. I became in my imagining the moving, singular, animate entity, and I left my room or my apartment or my house and went to Bartlesville Walmart, where there were ge, scattered, plural, inanimate entities, many plastic objects being ogled, purchased, possessed by ba, plural, animate entities, which created incredible yearly waste hoarding in this, where she, that, was making ga, these, this one, into that one, that person, she, her, he, him, those persons, this, pragmatically obvious. Person or things, the foregoing, she herself, he himself, they themselves, all those who are buying, littering, dying. And in this imagining, I questioned, and why could I not be there by, over there apart, and yet become Nicolagri, a good man? And to myself I replied, well, I am interdependent here, and she who I see as a good woman who is mine. is not at that location at this time. What is this? I finally said after I'd read the whole thing. Judging by the last line, I thought maybe he was flirting. He had finished folding my laundry. I'll stop there. How do I hold all of these things in the story? I guess the attempting to hold and bring together, like this poem, the language, kind of the worldview of the language, the relationships between, as you characterized, Azareen, within the community, without it, those within it to each other, as well as the film itself and kind of that representation. I think it just comes from this this reality of our contemporary lives, that they're so dramatically fragmented and chaotic, such that it can be really hard to share some type of common points of reference beyond what is functionally the propaganda of like English TV. And so when we're trying to enter a cultural conversation, you know, I have to draw on, I feel that I want to mightily and broadly draw on every possible point of reference I can in order to constitute acknowledgement, shared acknowledgement of the current reality of Wajaje people. Because when you have like a people group and they're not really known or acknowledged, it's kind of like a functional cultural gaslighting of them, like, oh, that's not a thing. And, you know, you'll hear people tell you that who don't have a critical framework for kind of responding to non-colonial life. They'll tell you, if you write a short story, you know, and you say a word they don't know, they'll tell you that's not a word, you know. And so you have to write to be comprehensible in a way that you establish these realities, like deal out these realities like cards that people didn't, they're like, what? And people don't like to be told things they don't know. It's disorienting, you know? So I think that's just the best answer I can give, is it's just this desperation to kind of like acknowledge an unknown reality. So I bring in a lot to kind of, I guess, displace the shock or the I don't know things effect that readers might not feel, and instead move over to oh, you just said so many new things and I knew about some of them, and so that's the thing in this book, like I might not know these things, but it'll be okay.
Thank you, Chelsea. Just a reminder to everybody to mute your mics. So there's one sentence that really got me in this first story, and it's when the two of them are talking. I mean, first of all, there's the humor, right? When the protagonist first goes over and sees him, she says, I went over to him with his black jean jacket and his hat reading protector. He was normcore native cool. Just the sight of him almost made me laugh, thinking of the old pickup line, I couldn't help but notice you noticing me. And then they speak to each other in Wajaje, and then they switch to English. The protagonist switches to English and says, are you asking me to dinner? We smiled at my mistake of switching to English and our ability to understand each other. There was something about that line that just like went right through me, because I don't know, I just felt the pain of the limits of speaking in an ancestral language. And again, like, it's not that my pain as a person who's feeling like I'm losing my Farsi over the years is the same as yours, but that greeting somebody who is from my country or my nation, and at some point having to switch into English, and that kind of remorse of that collective sense of defeat, and trying still to kind of emotionally connect in the register of our own language, of our mother language, while having this like other conduit be enforced on us. It just feels very strange. And I thought that you did so much work in a very short space there. But speaking of languages, I wanted to kind of ask you, you were all about language and home in general, and you're very intentional in your inclusion of Wajaji in the book, which is the living language of the Osage Nation, excuse me. And you were talking about the relationship between language and land, and how when you displace the language from the land, something is lost.
Mhm.
And it made me think about the ways that language has its own memory and its own consciousness, its own wisdom. And that you feel as a writer, from what I've read about, your relationship to the text, a responsibility to include your ancestral language as a form of providing healing in life. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that from the perspective of craft, philosophy, self, any angle you want to come to at it would be great.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I agree so much, and I just want to echo what you said about that strange feeling of talking to somebody from your group, and there being a feeling of being kind of pushed down on, but then it unites you and pushes you apart, and how strange it is to live in this time. And I think that that's the feeling of not having your own kind of community sovereignty, which comes from being able to live in relation to land. And when I used to hear that type of thing years and years ago, I thought it was so cliche and ridiculous. It sounded so ridiculous to me. But at the same time, I had this experience growing up and I grew up in Southern Virginia, that the plants that were there and the trees and the grass, that these people, this landscape had kind of been there for me and gotten me through everything, and was just my deep relative. And I felt so crazy for feeling that way. And I just thought I couldn't tell anybody about that because they would certainly think I was insane. And when I went to college, I read a professor assigned and Scott Momaday's The Way to Rainy Mountain. And that kind of thinking was in that book, and I was freaking out. And so I wrote a paper, with my wild thesis that people are formed by landscapes. And, the professor was like, normal A. And I'd been doing really badly in this class until then. And I was like, what? And that's just what happened as I kept living, was that this framework that I was trying to kind of be a good English thinker, a good English reader of literature, because I really liked reading as a child, and I was really afraid to write, and I didn't get into that so much very confidently, but I wanted to, be good and be normal. And the way that I saw that reflected to me in the world was, to not view the land as like your relative. And so when Wajaji, I have to acknowledge when I answer how I think about land, that there are some different ways that Native people, or that people broadly, kind of think about it. There's like the fireplaces that Native people took when they were removed, and they kept their fireplaces going. And so there's this like connection to the land, like indigeneity is kind of what you would think of it as, like a functional indigeneity, versus, for me, I think that when a people is not protecting and respecting their land base of origin, as broadly as that's defined, or even some land base, there's a non-functional indigeneity. And that's where you come into like, oh, people are not indigenous, but they're Native American, or you have Indian status, and it becomes like a political identity. And in order to have that political identity, you have to have a culture, a land base, and language, or you can't have the status. So it's kind of goes at cross purposes to each other, that in order to be what we are, we can't have what we had taken away. And so your identity becomes really stressed, I think. And this leads, in my opinion, to basically kind of a sickness in the community, in which the things which define and make your identity strong are limited, and they're a form of power. And so you get people fighting to hold the strongest identity of a limited and stressed identity. And I think that when you can look at land protection, land connection, you get this bigger world and just more support, and you have this wholeness to you. I read recently in this essay by Jamie Figueroa in Emergence magazine that we have a brain in our heads. There's also a brain in the gut, and there's a brain in the heart. All of these things existing within the representations of neurons, but that those kind of neuron sets, they're one that we think of as the brain already in the dominant culture, and then one for the heart, an emotional brain, and a gut brain. And so I think that the living with some type of land connection and protection, responsibility, relationship, reciprocity, that really acknowledges and brings out that gut knowledge to the forefront, which in the way we live today is really kind of truncated and blocked.
That makes yeah, so much sense, to me, even in terms of our sort of collective ecological grief, that at the core of it is a kind of loss of that spiritual view of nature, and a loss of that understanding of our sense of beingness is not actually at the center of the larger universe, right? That there's a relationality, and that we have to understand and I think recover a real sense of like where we stand in that larger order, and that nature has so much to teach us, and so much like inherent wisdom and healing, that even in preserving land as a form of recreation, there is a sort of I think a lot of pain in that too, that I feel, right? That becomes the framework through which to preserve, and that isn't investigated in of itself as a context with its own problematic history, especially in relation to Native communities and their ways of being stewards of the land in a very different sense. And this is a slight leap, but speaking of like what makes us whole, and what makes it hard for us to be whole, there was another story that really resonated with me called Super Drunk, which again, there's just this tension of like humor in your work, and like taking on these huge issues. But there's a line, the protagonist here is attracted to a slightly older man, is feeling very uncomfortable in the attentions she's receiving from her father, and she keeps looking up online what it means to have a weak sense of self. And Google becomes some kind of guide in her like search for safety, really, which is humorous but also excruciating. And she says at some point that she's also looking stuff up on Psychology Today, which we all do, right? Like she's according to the magazine, the fact that she might be into the idea of Mark, and she's 19, Mark is 30, trying to manipulate her by not calling or paying attention to her on a date means she may suffer from a weak sense of self. Still, it feels like affection to her, all that effort to control her. Maybe next time she'll wait around for him and then say yes to drinking all night.
I think Mindy said it was locked and she had propped it, but
Please,
I gave her a key for but during her class. She probably locked it in.
Yeah.
please mute your microphone. If you are doing multiple things, as much as we love having you here, I think it's best if we don't interrupt our conversation. Thank you. So Chelsea, can you talk a little bit about this story and how it's speaking to questions of gender in this collection, which is so centered on female experience and anchored by female experience, and what reaching and leaving community and going into spaces of diaspora becomes synonymous with safety, and what is gained in that and what is lost in that, I think is a really interesting question that the work raises.
Yeah, so going into spaces of diaspora, both creating and removing safety.
Yes, as you know, because she's trying to exit, right, the situation and yearning to be outside of it, but both physically, psychologically, emotionally.
Yeah, so this story is set, it's the only one that's set in Hampton Roads in Virginia, where I grew up. And I think that there's so many like dynamics that go into each narrative, but they're not necessarily all from, I guess, my same knowledge. And so I might be putting into a story like perspectives, like for instance, thinking about gender in Virginia, Southern Virginia, as I experienced it, was really, there's really different expectations in policing and norms than what I experienced when I moved to California, and somewhat different than living in Oklahoma. And so I think I might have set the story partially in Hampton Roads because I think there's such this intensity that I experienced that I wanted to engage on what it means to be a woman and to be expected to enact that performance, again, as a way to be accepted or be good in like a limited community. And so in this story, I guess like a lot of the characters have had less exposure to different ways of thinking. Like there's a limitedness to this story. Like the character is 19. She hasn't experienced a ton. She hasn't gone other places. And this older guy, he's like an ex-con. He hasn't had a lot of education. He hasn't had a lot of opportunity. And there's just this limitedness that they're experiencing. And I think that's why Lainey, she's looking things up on, because there's this maddeningness to when you want to learn and grow, but you don't know any of the language or the information or the resources, right? So yeah, I don't know if I'm doing a good job, but I guess I haven't thought or analyzed the story a lot beyond that. I think I just wanted to show that desperation to like, what does it mean when a person wants to grow, they want to change, they know, like in Osage, there's not a way to say sorry, but there's a phrase that's the closest thing to saying sorry, and it's, I don't like the way I am. I wish I were different. And that's how Lainey is. She doesn't like the way that she is, but she is that way. And she doesn't know how to change, but she kind of has to if she's going to survive. Mental health wise, definitely, but also physically, there's some risk between her father and this guy. It's not high risk, but she's very sensitive and she just feels scared. So yeah, that's my question in the story is, how do you grow when you don't even know what it is you're trying to become? You don't know the language for it. You don't know anyone who's done it. You don't know how to do it, where to go. You're just kind of in the dark, Googling.
Absolutely. And it just, I think like connects with the other stories and the struggles. So, you know, so beautifully in the sense of like, yeah, who are we and how do we learn who we are through other people, right? That we have this kind of false sense of our identities, especially within like Western frameworks of identity as being kind of rooted in the individual versus like it's coming from so many different sources. It's sort of like a sort of collage of the land, our language, what people are saying to us about who we are, right? What we're perceiving that they're saying, how we're being represented or how we're invisible in the world. And yeah, she's just such a tender character. And for me, it connected back to the opening story, specifically when the protagonist in that story is being asked, like, are you leaving and never coming back again? You know, and that's kind of a question that I think is really animating a lot of the work. So I have two kind of questions. One is craft and one is like more philosophical, but I want to encourage people to start putting their questions in the chat. Or thinking of your questions, you can raise your hand. And at that point, we very much love to hear your voices. Or if you're more comfortable, I can read your questions out loud. But I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about this concept of rematriation and how you might understand it, the specific ways in which it aligns spirit and matter, and what kinds of social contract that would uphold rematriation would look like. And I understand rematriation also as a way of like making ourselves whole and coming back to ourselves, and that accountability piece you were talking about with her character. And then because so many of these stories are kind of about coming home and going away, coming home and going away, how did you order the collection? Like for those of us who are writers here, how did you decide like which story comes first and next and what's in the middle?
Okay. I'm making notes so I don't forget. Okay, so first I'll talk about rematriation a little bit, and I'll start with just going a little further about Lainey and as her as an example sort of what might happen in her future. So when someone is in diaspora, which I'm defining specifically in this instance as being in diaspora, not only from land, but also from a community, from a people, or from a nation. And so Lainey is like, this is one of the only stories where she's like the only native character, and she's Osage. She knows she's Osage, and part of why she likes this guy, isn't he Cherokee, or did I change that from other details? Yeah. So there's this like attraction to somebody just because they're from her group, even though it's endangering her. And that makes sense, right? That's very human. And for her to be outside of her community, I actually think it creates a lot more danger. Like, people don't see that fully or know it, but the history of being away from a community means there's something happens that led to that leaving, right? So for a lot of Osages, it could have been after boarding school, people came home meaning to Osage County, to their allotment land, to their families, and their parents may have either been murdered from the Reign of Terror murders, or they may be an older person who speaks Osage, and this younger person like has just gone through all this trauma of boarding school and losing their language. And the kind of the rhetoric, the bottom line of that experience is, wow, it's not going to work for me to be an Indian, so I should probably go. And not everybody did that, but a lot of people were basically, you know, like, oh, you've just undergone these years of trauma, you don't have the language, you don't feel like you belong, or you have a place in your community, you not have a purpose there, you've been trained for this other world, so go. And then you go, what you have is this like, oh, if the person's mixed, and with Osages, a lot of them are mixed French, like, oh, that would be good for them because they look white, they'll fit in with the white people. Well, what happens is that white communities have different norms, different ways of relating, different attitudes, and you may not be able to kind of understand what's going on. And so you're kind of this non-functional, seemingly white person who doesn't have kind of a family. You've been cut off from your family. It is so dangerous. So people usually go into like, there may be, and this is so complicated, but as in this story, super drunk, there may be like some type of denial or removal from life to cope because it's too much. Alcoholism or drugs, or maybe really, really hardcore Christianity where there's kind of this like separation from a lot of the world. And so I think that Lainey has to rematriate to live, kind of. What is she seeking for her safety? She's seeking both like literal physical safety from her father, and she's also seeking other Native people. She has a car, so she's going to go and start looking for a community, a place to belong, a place that's safe. Everyone needs a community. Some people, their community really starts with their family or their faith, but when you lose all of that, or it's endangering to you, you have to go find a community. You're like unsupported, you're vulnerable. And so when you're going to rematriate to a given culture, and specifically for Native people, but also just for any tribal or land-based people, or just for people who have culture and practices that are specific, I think that you have to come back with a lot of humility, because there can be this like, there's so much wounding that a person separate from their community has undergone. Sometimes that can manifest in this like, okay, I've come back, that's a noble deed, right? Now teach me, like welcome me. But there's this dynamic of, okay, yes, but you also left. And the leaving was a rift, whether it was your fault as the comer backer or their fault that they pushed you out and there was a fight. This is going to be basically like a healing, a mediation. You know, there's going to be tension. And so I think that you have to, if you're going to go, if you need to, and you have to, and you're going to heal yourself by reconnecting to some degree with some community, you have to come kind of knowing that you might not be welcomed by everyone. And you have to come humble with really clear, short questions. And you have to kind of be strong in a way, like you have to be assertive. So I think that Lainey, if she goes back wherever she ends up, you know, if she, at some point she's going to her community, she's probably, it's a good idea to be quiet and listen at first, to go to the cultural center, just take it slow in a way and be respectful and not kind of like overshare or expect everything all at once, and just know that like these people, your community, are there for you. They are your family. They will welcome you, but you have to take it slow and be assertive and know that this is the right thing for you, and take time to rebuild that trust that was broken by the rift. And that's really hard, because reconnecting in Osage community is not always that straightforward. And that's because of the ongoing oppression of colonial life. So, as in terms of the physical and spiritual effects of rematriation, though, like being on your land, being around your people, specifically taking classes in and learning like a technique like weaving or sewing, or just whatever it is that's important in your culture, cooking, those things, doing those things with other people, and just showing up to events where you can learn that stuff, it is so transformational. I don't know, like it just, those parts of your brain that I was saying, you're wanting to become and change into something that you don't have, you're literally receiving. And yeah, in terms of the ordering of the stories, I originally had them, like I was thinking about the collection as like a person in a car who's fleeing different things, or going home to different things, or returning, or just leaving and returning. And I wanted it to be like a really long journey with all these stops. Like I wrote it out, like I think SF, like a SF to LA to Santa Fe to Oklahoma to, you know, just like that's how I had it. But I think my intention in ordering it was, again, in the way it is in the book, is just to make it like understandable even to people who have like no concept of Wajaje people at all and have never heard of us. And so I ended up structuring it in a way that I think just presented the most flow or dynamism of like Wajaje people are diverse. Each one that you encounter, each life setup could be really different. And here's a way to kind of like understand some of these characters. And within that broader organizational framework of encountering kind of a new people and their diversity, and how they're not all from even the same racial group, that like Native people have been racialized, you know, but inherently the nation wasn't that way. Like we took other tribes into us and we separated from other tribes, and we would bring French people into certain parts of marriages for the tribe. And then you go into other parts of history, you get further mixing. So even that, right? You can't even know a Wajaje person by, it's hard. So that was my first thing, was I just want people to kind of understand Native people are diverse, you know, they're not all one way. They're really diverse. Beyond that, I wanted to show like not everyone has the same thinking of like being traditional. And I end the book kind of with the most possibly sort of traditional story. I also want to look at this question of the book of like, what does it mean to heal? So the stories are pulling and pushing at that, like somebody trying to heal, somebody kind of tearing their life apart a little bit as a part of going through healing. Like sometimes in order to heal, you have to go through night, you have to go through the dark, you have to go through this period of realizing that things aren't okay. And part of healing is literally that first step, is when you realize you need to be healed from something.
Yeah, you have to walk through that fire. And I think one thing you said that really resonated, I mean, everything resonated, but in particular, the kind of understanding the balance between being assertive and the art of listening, right? When we're re-entering our communities, and the multiple truths that need to be heard in returning after a deep fracturing like that, and that they will be contradictory, and They're not going to add up to, one neat number. And that's complex to hold. Ultimately, I think very worthwhile, because that's the nature of life, is it's not very neat. We have a question here that I think ties in really nicely to this conversation. Tezi, would you like to speak, or would you prefer me to read your question?
I can read it if you would like.
Go
Just give
for
me
it.
1 second.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to read it, and then if there's any questions, I can clarify as well. But it was really powerful to kind of hear what you were saying about finding, healing and healthy dialogues with community, and kind of how that sometimes is done through like activities and things like that. And I study migrant narratives, particularly after transnational family separations that have happened due to like external factors. So that colonialism piece also speaks a little to that. And kind of how the reconnecting process is a struggle, particularly between mothers and children, is what I'm studying the most. And I was just curious to see if you have anything to say in kind of how retelling life stories, I'm looking at kind of memoirs and testimonies in particular in Mexican diasporas right now, and whether you think those could be like, or what role they play in kind of like the healing process of knitting back a community and sort of fostering intergenerational dialogues.
Yeah, Tezi, that's a really beautiful question. And thank you for your work studying reconnection and migrant narratives. That's really important. And yes, I think that retelling stories actually is really important, because what happens is that people who, the people in the community and the people who are returning to the community, they both have a lot of questions. Like those who are returning, I think the question, they know maybe to some degree, like what happened, why they left and things like that, maybe not. But establishing that, what happened, where did you go, why did you leave, even if it's known, just naming that. I think it's really important, because you will hear that. I hear that question in Wajaje community where people say, leave me Wakumbra. I want them to come home. But there's also the sentiment of, well, why did they leave? Why did they leave? And it can feel, as the returner, I think sometimes like that question can be activating or just triggering, because it's like, well, I left because, and there's something that seems like, why should I have to explain that? It's traumatic, like whether it was boarding school or the argument or the problem or a rift in the community itself, or whether there was a murder, there can be this feeling of like, you should know why I left, and you should be begging me to come back. You should be, and it's like, this is sensitive. You have to be. So I think that both people telling how they felt, if you could do that, because I don't think you would be able to do that. Like you wouldn't be able to get these people to sit down in like a talking circle. You might host the talking circle and invite the people. And if you had the right office do it with the right incentives, I think you could get the people in the room. But more likely, you're going to need that pre-dialogue. And so, like an example, my cousin, Amy English, she led, and I partnered with her in editing this Reconnection zine. And we were inspired by Lyrica Fisa-May, who's a therapist and a writer and like an anti-racism worker in New York. And Lyrica has this press, and Amy and I kind of invited Amy and I, do you want to make a Reconnection zine? And so we tried our best to just include many different people's perspectives. And so I love that you asked that question, because I don't think that I would have necessarily centered that, but I do think that has to happen in whatever way it can happen. There have to be these acknowledgements and stories. And some of the simplest way to begin, if you want to know, is just telling people, who is your family? They call it Wahoi in Osage, like acknowledging relationality. You know, my mother is, my father is, my grandmother is, my grandfather is. These are the people I come from. This is why I'm returning. This is why we left.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much for being here and for taking the time to answer my question.
Yes, with so much pleasure.
Thank you. I think we just have, is it a question or a comment by Nuzhat Abbas? If I can read it. Chelsea's description of the challenges of return to community resonates so deeply with conversations I've had with authors while editing an anthology on decolonial feminist translation, River in an Ocean. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And of course, all these things are complicated by gender as well, right? And that's very, very important to the conversation and to your book, Chelsea. So if we don't have any other questions, we can wrap up. Anybody else? We have just a minute or two.
You're mentioning of gender and me thinking about it again in Super Drunk. I do want to acknowledge that like colonial identity and colonized identity and ancestral identity in terms of gender identity are really different.
Mm-hmm.
But they can be really different, and concepts of representations and experiences of gender from that are affirmed by ancestral communities can be really different and diverse. And I think that's very interesting. Like most people here might have already heard that Navajos have 5 genders. And Osages, as far as I'm familiar, we have Mijoke, which is sort of a person who could be like functions as a man or a woman. There's a duality.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many within different cultures, there can be really different expressions or manifestations or understandings of gender, whereas colonial gender identity is so binary, and sometimes it's hyper exaggerated. But then people within the community don't all internalize that colonization, and you see still multiple expressions of gender. And so I don't think that, I mean, my book definitely looks at this question of like, what does it mean to be a woman, an Osage woman? And it's super interested in that idea of what is a woman? What are these roles for women? And as in contrast, looking at the expectations, the hyper oppositionality between men and women as 2 poles. But I think there's a lot more to be thought about there. It was one of the original questions I had when I was writing the book. I remember telling Sterling Harjo, who made Reservation Dogs, the TV show that has Creek Res Kids in it. I was telling him what I was applying to the Tulsa Artist Fellowship for, and I was like, well, I went to look at an examination of, it can be this way sometimes. I'll look at the examination of what gender roles are for Native men and women and how they could be changed. And he was like that's so kind of like, what? You know, like our women do this, like and you're like, that's like, you would not mess with that, you know? And I'm like, okay, but I'm not talking necessarily about traditionally, I'm talking about like functionally. And you see so much stuff. I was inspired also by, you see all these things on Instagram in popular wisdom of like, toxic. You need to leave people, you need to set boundaries, cut people off, and engage. And then with the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and people, you have protection of men who are an enabling of men who are predators, because why? Kind of question mark, right? Like I wanted to look into those things in the book, like this idea of toxicity, internalized toxic masculinity, which I can have definitely, and then toxic masculinity itself, and enabling toxic masculinity, and just this idea of, you know, androcentrism, where maleness and ideas of masculinity are at the center of what's acceptable, and then like a hyper femininity comes to kind of support that. And I just had so many questions, like how do you heal with someone who's in your family if they're like, are they a lost person? Are they like a trash person if they're toxic, right? And can you, like, what's the idea? Instead of calling the police, you do transformational justice. Like, can you use transformational justice for people who, or do you have to cut everyone off? And what about when you love people in your own community who are violent? So, I mean, I've been, I think, avoiding like answering your question because I'm just like, it's just, I don't have any answers, you know, but the book definitely leans into those questions.
Thank you, Chelsea. I think those are very uncomfortable questions to raise for a lot of readers. And, you know, very, very taboo. And I was asking a lot of questions like that from a different angle in Savage Tongues, and how it all interacts with desire and who we're taught to desire in contexts of colonialism within the sort of, you know, Middle East, and ideas of purity and sexuality, right? And repression as a kind of ideal of that supports binary gender, but that also supports silence in the face of gender-based violence, intimate violence. But to kind of not, as you know, as I hear you saying, like sharing with you this kind of pause when it comes to ideas of throwing people overboard, and can't, you know, just when we encounter these forms of toxicity in our communities, might be a band-aid for the moment, but I think the work we all have to do is so much more complicated and so much deeper. And that, you know, toxic masculinity, you said it so beautifully, being at the center, like this organizing force, right? It's just like the centrifugal force in the middle, and it distorts and bends everything, and it harms men as well. I think we're beginning to see that, and we'll have to grapple with that, right? So good that we can raise these questions and that we don't have to answer them. And I think that raising them is the work in of itself. Thank you so much for being here with us, and for your grace and your vulnerability, your openness, your intelligence, and your work. And we are lucky to have your company. We will be circulating this video, so please share it with anyone you know who couldn't make it out today to be on Zoom, but that you think could use this conversation personally or in a classroom setting. Our next event, we are decentering English this year. Our next event on March 24th will feature Afghani writers. It will be in Dari and in Farsi. We will have a simultaneous translator. Please do join us. Ali Atai and Atiq Rahimi will be in conversation with Iranian author Amir Ahmadi Aryan. The link is here. Please sign up for our listserv, all good things. Take good care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you next time.